of myths. Views that we should actually set aside and not allow them to begin to transform us and begin to shape us. Not allow these views that although may be held by others, we will just kind of let down and let go of, so that we have a better understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so this morning, we're going to look at one particular view that perhaps for many is one of the greatest barriers, one of the greatest stumbling blocks to people truly trusting in God, to people truly being willing to say, I will believe in you. Because the challenge in many people's minds is until they can get this issue, this frustration, this difficulty straight in their mind, they're not going to trust in God. They're not going to willingly give their life in obedience to following Him. And the issue has been phrased in a number of ways, but I'm going to phrase it this way. That because of the pain and suffering in the world, God cannot be both all-powerful and all-loving. Phrased another way, that because of the pain and the hurt and the tragedy that we see too often on a common occurrence, that God ultimately can't be trusted. Because the argument goes a little bit like this, that if God is all-powerful, that if God is able to stop and to start whatever it is He desires, then He must not be all-loving. Because then why would a loving God allow such suffering and brokenness to exist in this His world? The other side of the coin is, well, God may be all-loving, that God may not want these things to be occurring, but then is God then not all-powerful? Because then why isn't God stepping into the gap and preventing such difficulties and such suffering and such tragedy to occur? I would argue anecdotally that for many, this issue around suffering is perhaps one of the greatest barriers to people truly experiencing the reality of God. It's not an easy conversation to have. It's not a conversation that should simply be at a theoretical level where we espouse philosophical views, because for each and every one of us here in this room, suffering is real and suffering is personal to a greater or lesser extent. I know that for some of you here this morning, that suffering is more than a conversation. It is a raw reality here today. So we see suffering at a personal level. We also see suffering in the midst of the brokenness of the world in which we live in a more corporate level. I mean, here we stand and we remember and we think back on Remembrance Day. And although we come and we give thanks for the men and women who served in such a selfless way, the service was necessary because of the brokenness and the sin and the evil in this world. And we continue to look at the difficulties around the world. We still see the fighting and we still see the tragedies. And so this issue of suffering is not one that can be easily avoided. I would say that regardless of where you stand on the spectrum of faith, whether you are a follower of Jesus or you have chosen not to follow Him, that this still remains an issue for us all. You know, by simply giving up your belief in God because you cannot reconcile this problem doesn't make the pain and the hurt go away. At the same time, there's a myth that needs to be completely released and let go of. This idea that if you follow Jesus, then suddenly all the disappointments, all the hurt, all the tragedy will be no more. That when we speak of the abundant life, it's not a life without hurt, without difficulty, without challenges. Because regardless of who you are, regardless of where you live, we are not immune to suffering. And so perhaps the question is, how do we respond? How do we respond to the brokenness and the hurt that just seems so ripe in the world in which we live? I would suggest this morning that perhaps one of the challenges that needs to be overcome is in realizing that perhaps we're asking the wrong question. That we're focusing our attention on areas and on issues that we likely will never get answered to. Because I'm sure we've all been in a situation, whether it has been a personal hurt or whether it's been a more corporate, worldwide tragedy, we begin to ask the question, why? God, why would you allow this to happen? We may not believe that you are the one that is causing this, but why me? Why them? If you read through the scriptures, you see this is a question that is often asked of God. A question that is often asked of Jesus, why these things have happened, why there is this brokenness in this world. And one of the most frustrating things about the Bible is that although God is frequently asked this question, I would say he rarely, if ever, truly answers it. That so often we ask, why are these things happening? Yet this, at times it seems to fall in silence. I do believe that there is a general response that we can give, but it's not always completely satisfactory. To understand why there is suffering in one word is love. It seems almost contradictory in terms, but to truly understand, when we go back to the very beginning in the book of Genesis, when God creates the heavens and the earth, when God creates man and woman in his image, he creates us so that we can have a loving relationship with him. And he creates us with the capacity to make choice whether to choose to follow him or to not. You see, God can't just simply create us and hardwire us to say, I want you to follow me, but then I'm only going to allow you to make good decisions. I'm only going to allow you to make loving decisions. To truly be free, there needs to be the other reality as well. And we see this played out in the very beginning with Adam and Eve. There they are in the garden, in perfect relationship with God. There is no sin, there is no brokenness, there is no shame. And God simply says to them, of the two trees in the middle of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, do not eat from them. And I'm sure we're familiar with the story. Adam and Eve are both deceived by the serpent, and they eat from the tree. And it's here that sin enters into the world. And it's here that brokenness enters into the world. And we begin to see that because of the actions of the two, that there are consequences for the rest of this world. And we can see that oftentimes in our own world, that oftentimes the suffering that innocent people experience in their life is because of the poor choices of others. That because of their inability to choose the right decisions and to follow the ways of God, we see incredible pain and we see incredible hurt and we see incredible suffering. And we can begin to understand that. But then there's all the but what abouts. What about natural disasters? What about earthquakes? What about famines? What about tsunamis? When people suffer and experience the pain and the tragedy. In Genesis 3 and verse 17, we read that because of the actions of Adam and Eve, the entire earth is cursed. That sin is not simply a relational reality between individuals, but sin has come and has penetrated and has broken this world in which we live. And that's why so often we hear the words given in Scripture that the whole earth groans because of our sin, because of our consequences, because of our actions. And so there's a part where you can step back and perhaps at an intellectual level, perhaps in a conversation, you can say, okay, I can sort of get it. I can sort of understand perhaps part of the why question, But if we're being truly honest, it doesn't bring a whole lot of satisfaction. It doesn't bring a whole lot of relief when you sit in the room with a family who has lost a loved one. When you sit and you turn on the TV and you see the tragedies that are happening in the world around us, and you say, well, I can understand that it's because of people's choices that things have gone wrong, and you say this, I find no comfort in that. Or I find very little. Which is why I began to come to the conclusion that perhaps God steers us away from the question of why, is because he wants us to focus our attention in another area in life. Because let me ask you this. In whatever issue of suffering or of tragedy or of pain that you were experiencing, if you could 100% know the reason personally as to the why, would it actually bring comfort? Would it actually bring a sense of hope and encouragement to continue on? You see, so often we try to explain the why, that we often misunderstand who God is. We try and attempt perhaps to maybe get God off the hook, and oftentimes it actually brings about greater hurt and discomfort in us trying to explain the why. One of the best examples of this in the Bible is in the book of Job, a story where we're told of a man who had everything. He had good health. He had a good family. He had tremendous wealth. And then Job is unaware. Remember, we're reading scripture at a bird's eye view. We're aware of other things that are going on. But Job suddenly, in a moment, loses everything. He loses his family. He loses his wealth. He loses his health. And there Job is left, scraping the boils off his body, wondering what on earth has happened. Why? His wife gives some advice and says, just curse God and die. Just call it a day. And so often that's, I think, a place that we go to in the midst of suffering. We just say, I cannot bear it anymore. I just want the pain to go away. But Job perseveres. And then Job has some friends. I'm not necessarily categorizing them as great friends, but he has friends who come along. And one of the best things that they do when they first show up is they say absolutely nothing. They remain quiet. They just simply be with him. It's what Henry Nouwen refers to as the ministry of presence, of just sitting and of being, and just allowing people to know that in the midst of the suffering, although we may not understand, you're not alone. But as we see the human condition begin to perk up in the midst of these friends' lives, suddenly they think, you know what, silence is sometimes unsatisfactory. There needs to be a reason. Job, there has to be something. Maybe it's something that you did, Job. Maybe there is some sin in your life that has caused this. And you got to think that as those words were coming out of their mouth, they'd almost want to put them back in again, because you're thinking, this is how you comfort your friends. And then God speaks. And God says, you guys got it all wrong. You need to stop speaking. But Job still wants to know the why, and God doesn't direct him in that path. Which for me has been a life lesson with dealing with people in the midst of grief, in the midst of hurt, with the midst of tragedy, is not trying to simply say the words to get God off the hook. Or to say things that oftentimes are more of a coping mechanism. I've heard things said, and there's times you just think, no words are way better. I hear people say it around funerals, well, God only takes the good. And I'm like, that's not helpful at all. Or I hear I hear people say to children who have lost a parent, well, God needed another angel in heaven. And I'm like, that's not true. That's not helpful. Because what image are we then painting of God? And so often, I think what God does not need from us is for us to get him off the hook. What God needs from us is the ability to live and to trust and to persevere even when we don't have the answers. And so as I step into people's lives and I see the pain and the hurt, I don't try for a moment to pretend that I fully understand, because everyone's hurt and pain is different. I don't try to attempt to give them answers that oftentimes would be unsatisfactory, but simply to sit and to be with them and to pray and to point them to the one who can bring healing, who can bring comfort. You see, I think the question we need to ask is not the why, but the how. Because the Bible is full of the reality of just how and just where we turn in the midst of suffering. It should strike us as peculiar, as odd, that the symbol that represents Christianity above all other symbols and images is the cross. Because the cross in Jesus' day symbolized pain and suffering and tragedy. And yet that is the symbol that has risen above all other images within the Christian faith as the one to represent what it is that we truly believe. It's in the cross that we see that God not only entered into our world, but that God in the very person of Jesus entered into our pain and our suffering and our hurt. But even more than that, Jesus in the cross bore a suffering that we could never bear. We see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before he is to be crucified. And we see this portrayal of how Jesus is with his disciples, and he leaves 8 of them aside. Judas is already left. And then he takes 3, Peter, James, and John, with them. And they come to another place. And he says, will you please pray for me? Not give me advice. Will you please pray for me? Because my soul is overwhelmed. But then Jesus even leaves them aside, and he goes and he has an intimate conversation with the Father. And here we see the dynamic of the Trinity, of the Father and the Son. And Jesus pours out his heart to the Father and says, I don't want to do this. Is there any other way? I don't want to do this. You see, Jesus was not simply concerned over the physical pain, which would have been great, over the emotional pain of seeing his earthly mother and his friends around him and to know the others that have abandoned him. It wasn't just that, it was something far greater. It was the spiritual pain of being separated from the Father. That as Jesus took on the sins and the brokenness of this world so that we could ultimately be healed, the Father would turn from him. And there was this spiritual separation. Jesus bore the ultimate suffering so that we would never have to. In Hebrews 2, verse 9, it says, Jesus died so that he might taste death for everyone. It's why the Apostle Paul, in developing and explaining his theology of the cross in the book of Romans, puts everything at stake on Jesus. When in Romans 8 he says, because of Jesus, there is nothing in life, there is nothing in death that will be able to separate us from God. Because of Jesus. And so it's right there that we begin to see the love of God. You see, we may not always know the answer as to why suffering, but we can know what the answer isn't. It's not because God doesn't love us. We see that lived out in the reality of the cross. But the story doesn't end there. That's why Paul continues in building his theology around not only the cross, but around the resurrection as well. And that's why we're an Easter people. That's why Easter is so significant, because Good Friday becomes good because of what happens on Easter. Paul in a later letter says, listen, if Jesus did not rise from the grave, then we're all fools. This is just not worth it. Because it's in the cross that we see not only the reality of God with us, but we see the ultimate reality of God building his kingdom here on earth. That because of the resurrection, we have a sense of hope. We have a sense of reality that the brokenness is not the way in which the world is meant to be. If you feel that rising up within, when you see brokenness, when you see hurt, when you see tragedy, I would actually argue that is one of the greatest evidence for the existence of God. Because God has wired us to want the things that he wants. And so when we see tragedy and brokenness and suffering, of course there's going to be a rage within. Because this world is not the way it is meant to be. God is redeeming this world in which we live. And jumping from Genesis all the way to Revelation, we come and we're given an image as to what this will be like. Revelation is not an easily understood or digested book, but it's the Apostle John that is given an image from Christ himself as to what God is doing in the midst of this world. And in Revelation 21 and Revelation 22, we are given this incredible image that I'm going to invite Marie to come up and share with us this morning.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing down from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse.
And what we see happening is John trying to describe in many ways that which is undescribable. So he's using descriptive language that we would understand. And when he refers to the idea that there will be no more sea in Jesus' day and in ancient times, the sea was the place of great fear and of uncertainty. And so it's the imagery that there will be no uncertainty. There'll be no fear. There will be no death. There will be no mourning. There will be no sadness. There will be no more tears. And then perhaps one of the great images that Jesus gives to us is again that imagery of a parent and a child. Where Jesus says, "And I will wipe every tear from your eye." It's an incredibly intimate act to wipe the tear off the face of someone who is suffering, someone who is hurt. It speaks to the depth of relationship. But it also speaks to the reality that as a parent who sees their child hurting, they come alongside and they embrace them and they wipe the tear away as a sign of bringing comfort into their life. And this is the reality, this is the hope that we may never understand fully the why question. But we can begin to appreciate and hopefully allow the comfort of the reality of the cross and of the resurrection to begin to bring hope and assurance. As in Genesis 22, we see the fullness of God's plan come together. Revelation 22. In Genesis 3, we see that Adam and Eve were banished from the garden because of their sin, because they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so God did not want them to eat from the tree of life, and so they were removed physically. But now in Revelation 22, we see there the tree of life again, and its leaves bring healing. It's healing for the nation, because the curse is no more. We begin to see the reality of God bringing comfort into the midst of suffering and hurt. One of the great realities, I believe, is that in tragedy and in hurt and in suffering, it rarely makes us neutral towards God. It either pushes us away or draws us closer to Him. To a place of saying, I may never understand, but I need to turn to you. It doesn't mean that we hold it all together. It means that we are able to speak honestly and openly with our Father in terms of the pain that we experience. We see the reality of Jesus in the garden, of wishing some other path, but then taking that place of saying, I will trust in you. It's not so much an answer as it is a posture we take, a willingness to trust, a willingness to turn towards God, even when there seems to be no answer to the why. We turn to the cross to know that we have a God who knows and understands and loves. And we have a God who brings ultimate hope into the brokenness of this world. Let us pray together.